March 1st, 1896. The sun rises over the mountains of northern Ethiopia, casting long shadows across a landscape that will soon witness one of the most shocking military defeats in colonial history. On this day, the dreams of European empires will collide with the fierce determination of an African nation that refused to bow. What unfolds in the next few hours will shatter assumptions about racial superiority, colonial invincibility, and the supposed inevitability of European dominance over Africa. This is the story of Adwa, where Emperor Menelik II and Empress Taytu Betul led their people in a battle that would echo through history, inspiring liberation movements across the globe and proving that even the mightiest colonial powers could be brought to their knees. But to understand how Ethiopia achieved the impossible, we must travel back to the treacherous world of late 19th century diplomacy, where treaties were weapons and mistranslations could spark wars that would reshape continents. The year was 1889, and in the Ethiopian town of Wuchale, two men sat across from each other, each believing they held the upper hand in negotiations that would determine the fate of an entire empire. Emperor Menelik II, recently crowned ruler of Ethiopia, faced Count Pietro Antonelli, representing the expanding ambitions of King Umberto I of Italy. The document they would sign on May 2nd seemed straightforward enough, a treaty of friendship and cooperation between two sovereign nations, yet hidden within its clauses lay the seeds of a conflict that would culminate in one of the most decisive battles in African history. The Treaty of Wuchale appeared innocent on the surface, establishing trade relations and defining boundaries between Ethiopian and Italian territories. But Article 17 contained language so deliberately ambiguous that it would become the flashpoint for war. In the Italian version, the article stated that Ethiopia was obligated to conduct all foreign affairs through Italian authorities, effectively transforming the ancient empire into an Italian protectorate. The Amharic version, however, told a completely different story. It granted Ethiopia the option, not the obligation, to use Italy for diplomatic communications, preserving Ethiopian sovereignty while offering cooperation by choice rather than compulsion. This was no accidental mistranslation. Italian negotiators had crafted the deception with calculated precision, knowing that Emperor Menelik could not read Italian and trusting that their version would become the internationally recognized interpretation. They believed they had secured Ethiopia's submission through diplomatic cunning, avoiding the costs and uncertainties of military conquest. For Italy, struggling to establish itself as a major European power alongside Britain and France, controlling Ethiopia represented a crucial step toward building a respectable colonial empire in the Horn of Africa, but they estimated the man Italians had gravely under they sought to deceive. Menelik II was no ordinary ruler. Born Saleh Mariam in 1844, he had risen from regional king of Shewa to emperor of Ethiopia through a combination of political brilliance, military acumen, and an uncanny ability to navigate the treacherous currents of both internal Ethiopian politics and external colonial pressures. Unlike many African leaders who found themselves overwhelmed by the technological and organizational advantages of European powers, Menelik understood that survival in the age of imperialism required adaptation, modernization, and above all, unity among his people. When the true nature of the Italian deception became clear, it was not Menelik alone who recognized the threat to Ethiopian independence. Standing beside him was Empress Taytu Betul, a woman whose political intelligence and strategic vision would prove instrumental in Ethiopia's resistance to colonial domination. Taytu was no mere ceremonial consort. She commanded her own armies, controlled vast territories, and possessed a network of spies and informants that stretched across the region. From the moment the Treaty of Wuchale was signed, she harbored deep suspicions about Italian intentions, warning her husband that their southern neighbors harbored ambitions far beyond simple trade agreements. The Empress had witnessed firsthand the methodical way European powers carved up Africa during the scramble for colonial territories. She understood that treaties were often merely the first step in a process that ended with foreign flags flying over African capitals and European administrators governing African peoples. When news reached the Ethiopian court that Italy was claiming Ethiopia as a protectorate in international forums, citing Article 17 as justification, Taytu's suspicions were vindicated in the most dramatic fashion possible. The revelations sparked outrage throughout the Ethiopian court. Nobles who had initially supported cooperation with Italy now saw the treaty as an act of betrayal that threatened the very foundations of Ethiopian sovereignty. Taytu took the lead in demanding action, reportedly tearing up copies of the treaty in full view of the court and declaring that Ethiopia would never accept protectorate status under any foreign power. Her defiance galvanized opposition to the Italian claims and pushed the initially cautious Menelik toward a more confrontational stance. In February 1893, after months of failed negotiations and increasing Italian intransigence, Menelik formally abrogated the Treaty of Wuchale. The decision marked a point of no return in Ethiopian-Italian relations, transforming a diplomatic dispute into an inevitable military confrontation. Italy had invested too much prestige in its claims over Ethiopia to back down gracefully, while Ethiopia could not accept foreign domination without betraying everything its ancient civilization represented. But Menelik and Taytu understood that righteous indignation alone would not be sufficient to resist European military power. The emperor had studied the fate of other African kingdoms that had fallen to colonial forces, and he recognized that Ethiopia's survival depended on rapid modernization of its military capabilities. While European powers assumed that African armies remained trapped in medieval warfare, Menelik was already transforming his forces into a modern fighting machine, capable of meeting European troops on equal terms. The emperor's military modernization program was comprehensive and remarkably sophisticated. Through diplomatic channels, he negotiated arms purchases from France and Russia, countries eager to limit Italian influence in the region. Ethiopian traders, operating through Djibouti and other ports, acquired thousands of modern rifles, artillery pieces, and millions of rounds of ammunition. By the time tensions with Italy reached their peak, Ethiopian forces possessed more than 70,000 modern firearms, including rapid-firing weapons superior to much of the Italian equipment. More importantly, Menelik ensured that his soldiers were properly trained in the use of these modern weapons. Ethiopian officers studied European military manuals, while foreign advisors helped establish training programs that transformed traditional warriors into disciplined soldiers capable of coordinated battlefield maneuvers. The emperor also reformed his military logistics, creating supply systems that could support large armies during extended campaigns far from their home territories. Meanwhile, Italian forces in neighboring Eritrea were preparing for what they assumed would be a brief and decisive campaign against a backward African kingdom. General Oreste Baratieri, commanding the Italian colonial army, had at his disposal approximately 17,000 troops, including both Italian soldiers and colonial auxiliaries recruited from local populations. The force was well equipped with modern artillery and supported by supply lines stretching back to Italian bases along the Red Sea coast. But Italian intelligence had catastrophically underestimated both the size and quality of Ethiopian forces. Reports suggested that Menelik could field perhaps 30,000 men at most, poorly armed and lacking the discipline necessary for sustained combat against European troops. These assessments reflected the racist assumptions that pervaded European military thinking, the belief that African armies were inherently inferior to European forces, regardless of equipment or training. As 1895 drew to a close, both sides were mobilizing for a conflict that would determine not only the fate of Ethiopia, but also challenge fundamental assumptions about racial hierarchy and colonial destiny that underpinned European imperialism across Africa. The mobilization that began in late 1895 represented one of the most remarkable military preparations in African history. When Emperor Menelik issued his proclamation on September 17th, calling upon the men of Ethiopia to join his army at Werilu, the response exceeded even his most optimistic expectations. From every corner of the empire, regional governors and tribal leaders answered the call, bringing with them seasoned warriors who had spent generations defending their territories against raiders and rival kingdoms. The assembly at Werilu became a spectacular display of Ethiopian unity that foreign observers struggled to comprehend. Ras Tafari Makonnen arrived with 12,000 troops from Harar, while other regional commanders contributed thousands more. The future father of Emperor Haile Selassie understood that this moment would define whether Ethiopia remained free or joined the growing list of African territories under European control. Across the empire, smiths worked day and night forging spear points and repairing firearms, while women prepared provisions for the long march ahead. Empress Taytu played a crucial role in this mobilization, raising 6,000 troops of her own, while coordinating intelligence networks that stretched deep into Italian-held territory. Her agents brought back detailed reports on Italian troop movements, supply routes, and defensive preparations. This information proved invaluable as Menelik planned his strategy, allowing him to understand not only Italian strengths but also their critical vulnerabilities. The Ethiopian army that assembled for the march north was unlike anything Africa had seen in the modern era. More than 100,000 warriors gathered under Menelik's banners, representing every ethnic group and region within the empire. Amhara highlanders stood alongside Oromo cavalry, while Tigrayan fighters brought their knowledge of the northern terrain, where the decisive battles would be fought. This was not merely a royal army fighting for a distant emperor, but a national force defending their homeland against foreign invasion. What made this army truly formidable was its equipment and training. The 70,000 modern rifles distributed among the troops included rapid-firing weapons that could deliver devastating volleys against attacking forces. Ethiopian artillery crews had trained extensively with their Hotchkiss guns, learning to coordinate fire with infantry movements in ways that would surprise Italian commanders expecting primitive tribal warfare. The ammunition supplies were equally impressive, with over 5 million rounds available for the campaign, ensuring that Ethiopian forces could sustain prolonged engagements without running short of firepower. The march north began in December 1895, as Menelik led his massive army across nearly 600 miles of challenging terrain toward the Italian positions in Tigray. This logistical achievement alone demonstrated the organizational capabilities of the Ethiopian state, as supply trains stretched for miles behind the advancing columns, carrying food, ammunition, and medical supplies for the enormous force. The emperor understood that keeping his army fed and equipped during the long march would be crucial to maintaining morale and combat effectiveness when they finally encountered Italian forces. As the Ethiopian columns moved north, Italian intelligence began to realize the magnitude of their miscalculation. Reports of the massive Ethiopian army initially seemed impossible to believe, as they contradicted every assumption about African military capabilities. General Baratieri found himself facing an enemy force nearly 6 times larger than his own, equipped with modern weapons, and led by commanders who understood both traditional African warfare and contemporary European military tactics. The Italian position in Eritrea became increasingly precarious as Ethiopian forces approached. Baratieri's troops were scattered across multiple fortified positions, unable to concentrate their strength against the approaching enemy. The general faced an impossible choice between retreating and abandoning Italian territorial claims, or advancing to meet an enemy force that vastly outnumbered his own troops. Political pressure from Rome demanded aggressive action, as the Italian government could not afford to appear weak in the face of African resistance. Meanwhile, Empress Taytu was implementing her own strategic vision for the coming battle. Her intelligence network had identified the critical weaknesses in Italian defensive positions, particularly their dependence on limited water sources in the arid northern regions. The Empress understood that controlling these water supplies could force Italian troops into desperate tactical situations where their technological advantages would be neutralized by Ethiopian numerical superiority and knowledge of local terrain. The psychological dimensions of the approaching conflict were equally important. Ethiopian forces were fighting for their homeland, their families, and their ancient independence, while Italian troops found themselves in unfamiliar territory, fighting for colonial ambitions that meant little to the average soldier. Menelik skillfully exploited this morale advantage, addressing his troops with speeches that emphasized the sacred nature of their struggle against foreign domination. As the Ethiopian army approached the town of Adwa in late February 1896, both sides understood that a decisive confrontation was inevitable. The narrow mountain passes and limited water sources in the region would force the opposing armies into close contact, where Ethiopian numerical superiority could be brought to bear against Italian defensive positions. The stage was set for a battle that would determine not only the fate of Ethiopia, but also challenge the fundamental assumptions of European racial superiority that justified colonial expansion across Africa. The final preparations for battle revealed the stark contrasts between the two armies. Italian forces, though well-trained and equipped, were operating far from their supply bases and surrounded by hostile territory. Ethiopian forces, by contrast, were fighting on familiar ground with the support of local populations who provided intelligence, supplies, and safe passage for wounded soldiers. These advantages would prove decisive in the coming engagement, as the battle for Ethiopian independence reached its climactic moment in the mountains surrounding Adwa. The dawn of March first broke cold and clear over the Ethiopian positions, as Empress Taytu moved through the ranks like a force of nature, her voice carrying across the mountain slopes as she rallied the warriors for what she knew would be the defining moment of their generation. Her personal army of 5,000 stood ready, their weapons gleaming in the early light, while behind them stretched the greatest African army assembled in modern times. The Empress had spent the night coordinating final preparations, positioning her forces to cut off Italian access to the precious water sources that would determine the battle's outcome. General Baratieri, commanding the Italian forces, faced a nightmare scenario that his superiors in Rome had never contemplated. His intelligence reports now confirmed what he had desperately hoped were exaggerations. The Ethiopian army was not only massive beyond his worst fears, but equipped with modern weapons that negated every tactical advantage he had expected to enjoy. The pressure from Rome was relentless, with telegrams demanding immediate action to salvage Italian prestige. Yet Baratieri understood that advancing against such overwhelming odds bordered on military suicide. The Italian commander's dilemma reflected the broader crisis facing European colonial powers when confronted by determined African resistance. The racist assumptions that had guided colonial expansion assumed that European forces would always enjoy technological and organizational superiority over African armies. Now, facing an enemy that had systematically negated these advantages, Baratieri discovered that colonial warfare was far more complex and dangerous than European politicians had imagined. On the evening of February 28th, a furious telegram from Prime Minister Francesco Crispi reached Baratieri's headquarters, goading the general into action with language that left no room for retreat or negotiation. The Italian government had invested too much political capital in Ethiopian conquest to accept anything less than decisive military victory. Crispi's message made clear that failure would mean the end of Baratieri's career and Italy's reputation as a serious colonial power. The general gathered his senior officers for what would prove to be their final council of war. The options were stark and none were appealing. Retreat would mean abandoning Italian territorial claims and accepting humiliation before the other European powers. Remaining in defensive positions would allow the Ethiopians to complete their encirclement and systematically destroy Italian forces through siege warfare. Only one choice remained: a desperate advance toward Adwa that might catch the Ethiopian army before it completed its preparations. Despite his misgivings, Baratieri ordered the advance for the following morning. His plan called for dividing his forces into 3 separate columns that would converge on Adwa from different directions, hoping to prevent the Ethiopians from concentrating their overwhelming numbers against any single Italian position. It was a complex maneuver that required precise timing and coordination, exactly the kind of operation that becomes impossible when facing a larger, more mobile enemy force operating on familiar terrain. As the Italian columns began their advance in the pre-dawn darkness, Ethiopian scouts were already tracking their movements and reporting back to Menelik and Taytu. The imperial couple had anticipated this exact scenario, positioning their forces to take advantage of the broken terrain around Adwa that would fragment Italian formations and prevent effective coordination between their separated columns. The Empress had studied the ground carefully, identifying positions where Ethiopian forces could mass quickly against isolated Italian units. The first contact came as the sun climbed higher, when Ethiopian advance guards engaged the leading Italian column in the narrow passes leading toward Adwa. What began as skirmishing quickly escalated as more Ethiopian units arrived to reinforce their comrades, while the Italian column found itself increasingly isolated from the other advancing forces. The modern rifles carried by Ethiopian warriors proved devastatingly effective in the confined terrain, where Italian artillery could not be brought to bear effectively. Empress Taytu had positioned herself where she could observe the developing battle and coordinate the movements of her own forces with those of the emperor. As the fighting intensified, she recognized the moment when decisive action would shatter the Italian advance completely. Her voice rang out across the battlefield, calling to the Ethiopian warriors with words that would be remembered for generations. Courage. Victory is ours. Strike. The effect was electric, as thousands of Ethiopian fighters surged forward with renewed determination. The battle that had begun as a series of separate engagements now merged into a general assault that overwhelmed Italian defensive positions. The three Italian columns, separated by difficult terrain and under attack from multiple directions, could not support each other as Baratieri had planned. Ethiopian forces, moving with the coordination that comes from fighting on home ground, concentrated against each Italian position in turn, using their numerical superiority to devastating effect. The psychological impact of the Ethiopian assault was as important as its military effectiveness. Italian soldiers, many of whom had never faced determined African resistance, found themselves confronting warriors who fought with a ferocity born of defending their homeland. The racist propaganda that had portrayed Africans as cowardly and primitive crumbled in the face of disciplined Ethiopian formations that advanced steadily despite heavy casualties, their modern weapons delivering devastating volleys that cut down Italian defenders. As the morning wore on, the Italian position became increasingly desperate. Ammunition began to run low, as units expended their supplies at unsustainable rates, trying to hold off Ethiopian attacks. Communications between the separated columns broke down completely, leaving individual commanders to make tactical decisions without knowing the fate of their comrades. The carefully planned convergence on Adwa had become a series of isolated defensive actions against an enemy that seemed to appear everywhere at once. Emperor Menelik himself led charges that broke through Italian defensive lines, his presence on the battlefield inspiring Ethiopian warriors to acts of heroism that European observers would struggle to comprehend. This was not the distant command style favored by European generals, but the personal leadership of a warrior king who shared the dangers faced by his soldiers. The sight of their emperor fighting beside them drove Ethiopian forces to levels of commitment that no mercenary army could match. The collapse, when it came, was sudden and complete. The Italian center, under overwhelming pressure from coordinated Ethiopian attacks, finally broke and began streaming backward in disorder. The retreat quickly became a rout as panic spread through the ranks, with soldiers abandoning their weapons and equipment in desperate attempts to escape the advancing Ethiopian forces. Entire units simply disintegrated as discipline collapsed and individual survival became the only priority. Empress Taytu's strategic vision had proven decisive in ways that European military observers would spend years trying to understand. Her control of water sources had weakened Italian forces before the battle began, while her intelligence network had provided Ethiopian commanders with crucial information about enemy positions and movements. Most importantly, her ability to coordinate the movements of her own forces with those of the emperor had created the kind of unified command structure that Italian forces, divided into separate columns, could not match. The artillery that Baratieri had counted on to offset Ethiopian numerical superiority proved ineffective in the broken terrain around Adwa. Ethiopian forces, advancing through ravines and behind rocky outcroppings, could close with Italian positions before the guns could inflict decisive casualties. When Ethiopian warriors reached close quarters, their modern rifles and traditional weapons proved equally effective against demoralized Italian defenders who had never expected to face such determined resistance. By noon, the Battle of Adwa was effectively over, though scattered fighting would continue for several more hours as Ethiopian forces pursued the retreating Italians. The magnitude of the Italian defeat was unprecedented in the annals of colonial warfare, with casualties exceeding 50% of Baratieri's entire force. Over 6,000 Italian and colonial troops lay dead on the battlefield, while nearly 4,000 more had been captured by Ethiopian forces. The cream of Italy's colonial army had been destroyed in a single morning by an African force that European racial theories claimed could never match white soldiers in organized combat. The immediate aftermath of the battle revealed the true extent of Italian miscalculation. Ethiopian casualties, while significant, represented less than 15% of Menelik's forces, demonstrating that African armies could not only resist European invasion, but do so at acceptable cost when properly equipped and led. The weapons and supplies abandoned by fleeing Italian forces provided enough equipment to arm several more Ethiopian regiments, while the prisoners taken would become valuable bargaining chips in future negotiations. As news of the disaster spread through Italian ranks, the psychological impact proved as devastating as the military defeat. Soldiers who had marched north confident in their racial and technological superiority now found themselves fleeing in disorder from an African army that had outfought them at every level. The myths that sustained European colonial expansion lay shattered on the slopes around Adwa, where Ethiopian warriors had proven that determined resistance could overcome even the most confident imperial ambitions. The battle's conclusion marked more than a military victory for Ethiopia. It represented a fundamental challenge to the racial ideologies that justified European dominance over African peoples. At Adwa, the supposed superiority of white civilization had been tested in combat and found wanting, creating ripple effects that would eventually reach every corner of the colonized world. The impossible had become reality, and nothing would ever be quite the same again. The reverberations of Adwa echoed far beyond the battlefields of northern Ethiopia, shaking the foundations of European confidence and sending shockwaves through colonial capitals from London to Berlin. In Rome, the news arrived like a thunderbolt, shattering the comfortable assumptions that had guided Italian foreign policy for decades. Prime Minister Crispi, who had goaded Baratieri into his disastrous advance, found his government collapsing as opposition politicians and angry crowds demanded answers for the humiliation that had befallen Italian arms. Across Europe, diplomatic circles buzzed with reports that seemed almost impossible to believe. An African army had not merely resisted European conquest, but had delivered a crushing defeat that destroyed an entire colonial expedition. Military analysts pored over every detail, searching for explanations that would preserve their theories about European superiority while acknowledging the undeniable reality of Italian failure. Some blamed inadequate preparation or poor leadership, but the more perceptive observers recognized that something fundamental had shifted in the balance between colonizer and colonized. The victory at Adwa became more than a military triumph. It became a beacon of hope that pierced the darkness of colonial oppression across the African continent and beyond. From the townships of South Africa to the villages of Nigeria, from the plantations of the American South to the islands of the Caribbean, oppressed peoples looked to Ethiopia as proof that resistance was not futile, that the mighty could indeed fall before the righteous. The Battle of Adwa had shattered more than Italian dreams of empire. It had broken the myth of European invincibility that sustained colonial rule across the globe. In the mountains of northern Ethiopia, Emperor Menelik and Empress Taytu had not only defended their ancient kingdom but had lit a flame of defiance that would burn for generations, inspiring countless freedom fighters who would carry forward the legacy of March 1, 1896, when Africa stood tall and the world took notice.